Hey guys, my name is Nick and welcome back to the channel, and in this video we are continuing painting the Armiger Warglaives. And yeah, this is the second part of the video, the final part in this series, where we get into some of the detail and we finally get the model all up and running. Well, everything except the basing, to be honest, so not worried about the basing just yet, but this is going to complete the painting guide because you can base them exactly how you want to fit in with the rest of your army. But before we get into the start of the video, I've got a couple of thank yous and a couple of shout outs to make. So the first thing you may have noticed is a little bit of new channel art. So I've got a new banner and a new logo. And I want to thank one of my subscribers, Glenn, who is a bit of a whiz with Photoshop. I'll put a link up to his Instagram. He doesn't do YouTube, he does do Instagram. He's a big fan of Age of Sigmar, and he sort of offered to jazz up my channel a little bit and give us some new artwork. So let us know in the comment section what you think of how it looks, because I'm quite impressed and it looks a bit more exciting than what I've had in the past. Second up, I've actually got my first Patreon. Rather impressed with that. I wasn't expecting anyone to ever even consider contributing to the welfare of the channel. And the Patreon is from bitsbox.co.uk. And they've been around a long time. I haven't used them myself for quite a while, to be honest, because I'm not the biggest converter in the world. But if you're looking for specific bits, for those kind of conversions, if you're a real converter freak and you're looking for those extra melter guns, that particular head or jetpack, this is the kind of place that supplies those bits exactly for you. And for being a Patreon, they get to have a permanent link in my description of all my forthcoming videos, and obviously this shout out. So one big thank you very much indeed to my first Patreon. Really appreciate it. Completely unexpected. Not required by anybody, but if you do want to contribute, then be my guest and you will be forever in my debt, and thank you very much. Anyway, let's get straight on to the painting guide. So as a brief reminder, this is exactly where we'd got to before. We'd completed all the metalwork and all the legs and kind of brass effect. Now that brass is either going to stay brass or it's going to get moved into gold. So we'll cover that a bit later on. But what we're going to do now is go on to the armour panels. So this is all of the top shell, shoulder pads, knee pads, shin pads, and the groin guard as well. And what I'm doing is using Legio's Night Blue, which is a very dark blue, but it is the one that's part of the colour scheme for the Warp Runners, the Legio Astorum, which is the scheme that I am following here. So a good solid coat of this dark blue through the airbrush, reasonably well thinned, just to make sure that it flows nicely and gets all the right coverage. So you can see me just working around all the different angles in the airbrush booth, just spraying it up, and you can see after a couple of sort of build-up coats you can see it beginning to start adopting that blue colour. As I said, it is quite a dark blue and it does take a little while for the colour to take, but once it does you can quite clearly see that beginning to go into that blue shade. So we're just making sure that we cover all the angles and all that kind of stuff, making sure that everything is given a good solid coat. Because it is quite well thinned, it does dry very quickly, which is why I'm sort of circling back and forth over and over the different bits of panel and so on. It doesn't run or anything like that because it is such a decent paint mix. So what we do now is we can move on to each individual piece. I'm just going to show the top carapace here, for example. And we're using Imperial Blue, Legio's Imperial Blue now over the top of the other blue. And I'm trying to make sure that I only pick sort of the highest points and leaving some of that night blue in the recess. So just being really careful on the application here. So you can see me starting off with the easier part, which is that nice top ridge, and then moving round to the sides and then all of the side edge parts, and just making sure that, yeah, just sort of around in the... There's no real recesses as such, but where the light would naturally sort of vanish in sort of that big crease down the side, making sure I don't push too far into there with the Imperial Blue. And remember, I'm only doing this on the top shell piece. You're going to repeat this process exactly the same for all of the other armour panels as well. So where I'm doing this in blue, then it'll just be repeated on those ankle pads, knee pads, and shoulder guards as well. So exactly the same thing, and just apply it to the other parts. Now once that's all dry, we move on to some washes or some glazes, but pushing these through the airbrush as well. We're going to start with Druchii Violet first. So this is the Games Workshop Druchii Violet, and I'm just going to sort of streak random patterns like marbling effect across those blue panels. It's a little bit stuck in my airbrush in this example, unfortunately. It doesn't flow completely smooth, but you can see those purple streaks just beginning to take effect and just make random patterns across the blue. And then we just rinse and repeat that exactly the same thing. This time I'm using Games Workshop's Drakenhof Nightshade. So this time it is like a blue glaze, but pushing that through in random streak effects as well. And then once we're complete, we have all of the panels all done. Or certainly done for the blue effect. And the next stage then is to give them a gloss varnish. Now this makes it a quite a little bit shiny on the armor panels. It might not be to everybody's taste. You might want to matte varnish this, for example. But as I said, I am in the previous example, in the previous video, I am copying the Imperial Armour Volume 2 guide. And for their guide, what we do is we gloss varnish. And you can see those purple colours actually beginning to sort of shine through once they've been varnished. This camera angle really does pick it up quite nicely. And yeah, sealing it in with this gloss varnish does sort of make those colours pop a little bit more, certainly to the naked eye anyway. And you can see that effect as I apply more and more varnish to these. You can see those colour patterns and drifts and swirls and so on in that blue begin to take effect. And so just making sure that you give it a nice good coat of varnish and then put that aside to dry for quite a while. It is an acrylic varnish. It is Winsor & Newton's gloss varnish mixed with some white spirit. It's about 50-50, maybe 33 varnish to 66. Get my percentages right. 66% of the white spirit, just to make sure that it flows through the airbrush and it doesn't damage any of the paintwork applying white spirit in that way. So whilst that's all to one side, we can now move on to finishing some of the other details off on the rest of the chassis, especially the top torso. So first things first then is taking all of that brasswork and giving it a coat of Agrax Earthshade. So it's pretty much a standard approach for all of the brass on the model. I did it exactly the same on the leg section if you want to catch up on part 1 of the video. And that is all brass gets Agrax Earthshade. And that is, I think that's a rule in life. I think anything that's brass should get that. Now while that's drying, we can move back to the armour panels. So where these have now all dried and the varnish is now fully set, do not touch these until the varnish is set. Otherwise you will leave nasty fingerprints all over your model. If you're not sure the varnish is dry, then leave it another 24 hours and just make sure that it is, because you can't really go back on that stage. It's a kind of be all and end all. But once I was happy that it was dry, it's kind of back to the brass and gold trimming effect. So this is brassy brass once again, just following around all the trim sections on all the different armour panels. Don't forget, at the same time you want to be doing the shoulder pads and the knee pads, the shin pads and everything else, exactly as I've done here. And then move straight on and do your Agrax Earthshade wash, exactly as we've done with all the other brass sections. I'm not going to repeat that because we've already covered that. So what we're going to now do is turn some of this brass into gold trim. So I've got my Glorious Gold from Vallejo and I've got a very small dry brush. And once that Agrax Earthshade is dry, all we're going to do now is very lightly dry brush that brass, well, the darkened brass, with the Glorious Gold colour that I'm using here. And you're really trying to just pick out all the sort of the raised edges really, and the rest of the brass and the Agrax will just act as a natural shade to it, and it'll make it sort of a nice darkish gold. I don't want it to be, you know, super bling. You know, these aren't Legio Custodes or Adeptus Custodes. You just want a nice, subtle, brought up, shiny look without it being too ostentatious. So really trying to pick out some of those, you know, the higher parts, the edging and all that kind of stuff, and apply it across the entire brass panels that you've already done. And once we're done, this is the kind of effect we've got as we throw it across the desk. It's quite a subtle effect. As I said, you're not trying to turn the whole thing into a gold monster. So once we've done that bit, we can actually move on to sticking some of this together now. You'll notice in this particular part of the video, I haven't done that gold effect to the knee pads. I actually felt that it would be easier to hold them. Oh, sorry, it wouldn't be easier to hold them and do that than it would be to mount them on the model and then do it afterwards. So that's what I'm doing here. So what I'm doing is putting on those leg guards and shin guards, and then I'll be able to do the gold work once they're set on the model. It just means I've got something else to hold on to. I can hold on to the foot of the model and then control my dry brush afterwards, rather than sort of, you know, potentially getting that dry brush and mixing it into the blue armor panels, which you definitely don't want to do. it does take away from some of that effect. So just get those shin guards on, and then we're good to move on. So we just get the second shin guard on now, and then we can put the groin guard into place, and that's these all glued and ready just to dry really, before we then do that gold dry brush that I just mentioned. There's also a couple of other bits we can do at this stage as well, and that is to use a little dot of silver on all the rivets. Again, entirely optional, depends how detailed you want to go. But as I said, we're now going to go back to that glorious gold, and we can do exactly what we were doing on all the top panels, or the top chassis panel and the shoulder guards, and we can apply that to these parts here. And this was just personal preference to do it in this order. You can do it in any order you like, obviously, it's your model, but this I just felt made it a little bit easier, as I had something to hold onto while I was doing the dry brush. And so again, you can just pick out all the high points, so just be careful of the direction that you're dry brushing, and then the same effect applies that we've already done. So we can just sort of speed through this section and move on to the next part. So we can just have a quick recap of where we've got to then. So all that gold work has now been completed, and then we've still got some of these weapons which I've hardly touched so far in the painting process. Some of this could have been done simultaneously. I was just sort of messing around as I was doing the video. Certain bits do get forgotten, especially as I'm trying to paint 4 of these at the same time. So what we can now do is move on to some further detail now. Now if you look at the pictures of my Legio Astorum, you'll notice they've got a yellow cowl or a yellow helmet or something yellow around the face guard area, for example. And also on the chainswords and stuff, I've got yellow hazard stripes. So in order to get that effect, what I'm doing is anything that's going to be yellow first, I'm painting in a base coat of beastie brown. And that enables me to paint the yellow a little bit smoother and flatter over the brown than it does over the metalwork. So as you can see here, all I've done is patch in all those areas that are going to be yellow first. Now the brown is pretty translucent, and you're trying to make that cover a metal coat, so it will sort of take 2 or 3 thin coats to make sure that goes through nice and smooth. And you do want it to be smooth, you don't want it to be lumpy, otherwise it does ruin the effect of the yellow afterwards. But while that's drying on the chainsword, we can cover a couple of extra details that we're going on. So this is a very light dry brush of the bright sort of dwarven bronze, just to do that over the engine exhaust sections. I wanted to keep those a bit more brassy than the rest of the gold, so it does cause a nice transition. You don't want everything to be gold and you don't want everything to be brass, so keep it nice and mixed there, and engines in brass is always nice. So we can now move back to that yellow, because the brown has now dried, and I'm just applying a coat of sun yellow. So this will be mostly, pretty much all over the brown. Again, this will take about 2 or 3 thin coats in order to cover the brown properly. So just making sure that that goes on nice and smooth. Again, yellow does need to be smooth. It's the same as any pale colour really. If it's got any lumps and bumps in it, it does detract from the effect. So you want to keep it nice and smooth and just apply that yellow, as I said, 2 or 3 times over that brown, and you will get a nice smooth effect. And I've done exactly the same on the chainsword part as well, just to make sure that is exactly where I need it to be with that. I think that took 3 coats. Yeah, I'm fairly sure that took 3 coats of yellow in order to make that as smooth as it could be. And that's where we end up. These are the bits that are going to be yellow, and then what we do then is Cassandoran yellow, which is a lovely glaze to sort of tone that down and give it a nice little shade. Doesn't turn it completely orange, but just pushing that into the recesses and so on does make it, give it a little bit of warmth and a bit of depth rather than being sort of super bright yellow. So that's exactly what's happening next. Obviously going to be repeating that on the chainsword as well, especially where it sort of meets all the brass effect, and there's quite a few little bits of lines of detail and so on within the blade itself, so make sure you get all those nice and captured. But bear in mind, some of this is now going to be black as part of the hazard stripe effect. So what I do is try and get some nice smooth black lines on this to give it a nice hazard stripe which will match the rest of my Knight collection. So what I'm doing is taking my airbrush black. I do prefer this over the solid black. It does mean it does take a couple of coats to get through, but it means I normally have a nicer control. I normally find regular black straight out the pot can be a bit gloopy, even if you thin it a little bit. So using the airbrush stuff is pretty smooth, but it does mean you have to do a couple of coats again, even to cover the yellow, because it is quite thin. So yeah, just trying to sort of take this by eye really. I'm just going to do 2 black stripes on either side, one in that far corner and then one straight through the middle. I think that's enough. I mean, you could go thinner stripes and do more, but I don't see any need in that. It's quite a small sword really for a knight. So just going with 2 black stripes, and which means there'll be 2 yellow ones either side. Now what I did with the larger knights is actually mask this off and airbrush it, but because these parts are a lot smaller, trying to airbrush it would be a lot more tricky. So I actually felt that doing it by hand and eye was probably going to save me a lot of time and a lot of effort, and doesn't look that bad anyway. It's a pretty straight edge, and you can always, you know, go back over it and touch it back in until you're fairly happy with it. Now while that black begins to dry, we can now touch up some of the other details, and as usual with all most of my sort of fixed cabling and weird little bits of pieces that appear on this model, I'm going with a standard red. Just go with a nice bright red, just run that on some of the cables and some of the other detailing work that are on these weapons. Again, that causes a bit of uniformity across the rest of the model where I've got that red colour as well. And then finally, all that we do over the top of that red is just give it a Nuln Oil coat just to darken it down and make it, you know, look a little bit dirty, a little bit more worn rather than being sort of super bright. And then once we finish that up on this particular weapon, just making sure that you don't get any of the paint anywhere else, like I was just trying to rub off there, we can move back to the thermal lance, or thermal spear, sorry, on this one, isn't it? And just do the same kind of thing. So we can come back, and some of the details that I hadn't done on this particular weapon as I'd left it to one side and forgot about it. So we just need to catch up there, do the brassy brass and then the Agrax Earthshade. And while that's drying, I can go straight back into the red and catch up on this bit of the model. Now, you know, normally obviously you'd be doing this in parallel with the one big build. So if you'll get the red out, then you make sure you do all the red pieces. If you've got the brass out, make sure you do all the brass pieces. Obviously it makes more sense when you're actually doing it. But when you're building 4 and you're trying to film it, yeah, things are easily forgotten, I guess. So I had actually completely forgotten to start painting this bit. So we'll just catch up on there, get all those details on, and we're good to move on. So we can go back to our torso piece now. So while that yellow and the Cassandoran shade was drying, we can go back and I can convert all of that brass edging into a gold effect. So this is exactly the same technique as I've done on the shoulder panels, on the torsos, on the leg sections and all the rest of it. This is a very light dry brush across all of those frame sections, as it were, with the glorious gold from Vallejo. And that's all we're doing. So we can now move on to painting the little window on the top. So whilst the rest of the torso is drying, we can move on to other pieces, as is usual with my videos. So they do jump about a little bit, I apologise for that, but concurrent painting is what it's all about to get things completed. So the little window on the top, so we're starting with a 50-50 mix of night blue and black, and push that into the bottom right hand corner. That's our dark shade. Now we go for a mid-tone across most of the rest of the window. So this is a little bit of night blue and imperial blue mixed in. Sort of about 50-50 again, and that covers the rest of the window. And then what we'll do is we'll start highlighting up the top left hand side with progressive shades of blue and white mixed in. And that will then form sort of the glass mirror-y kind of effect that you're looking to go for. So all I've done now is taken that original mix of paint, that 50-50 imperial and night blue, and then just started adding some white to it. And all we're going to do is just in the opposite corner to where we did the sort of the black and the blue, we're just going to brighten it up and just do it in exactly the opposite corners and just progressively highlight that with thinner and thinner lines until eventually we just do a small spot of white in the top left and in the bottom right. And that's exactly where we've got there. There's a couple of other little bits of detail to do on the torso then, or on the top chassis section, and that is sort of the engine, or these engine vents at the back here. So they've been painted in chainmail, and all we're going to do then is just go over the top of those and darken them down with a bit of Nuln Oil. And also the same for the grab rail on the front as well. So where the pilot gets into that sort of top canopy section, he climbs in through this little top where that window is. He's got a grab rail to obviously facilitate him jumping into his war engine ready for battle. And all we're doing exactly the same as there. We're just painting that chainmail and then giving that a go over with the Nuln Oil. Nothing more than that really. There's nothing too fancy about that. And whilst that window has now all fully dried, we can just go over it with a little bit of gloss varnish, make it look like a piece of glass. That's the general idea anyway. I think it looks kind of like a bit of glass, I guess. It's the standard kind of way of painting lenses and glass and all that kind of stuff on these kind of models. So with the upper torso pretty much done other than finishing off the yellow, we can start putting this bit together as well now. So all we need to do is just glue that top section onto the main body, and then we can move on to the next piece. Now the next section we're going to do is highlight up all the yellow pieces. So I've got the gold yellow, the sun yellow and white. And we're going to highlight up that head crest crown area and the yellow stripes on the chainsword. So what I normally do for this is I apply all three of those colours to my palette. And then what I'll do is I'll blend the darker yellow and the mid yellow together to sort of form a 50-50 paint with a bit of water. Fill that into all the gaps here, so you can see that quite clearly on the chainsword more than anything. So you can still see that shade in the recesses, an interim colour, the base colour, and then this higher colour. And then as we go progressively high, you can take this as many stages as you like. I think I did sort of 2 versions of the yellow and then added the white into it to form the final edge highlight colour. So what we do now is we can just apply that final edge highlight to the very sharp lines that are around that head. That's quite an easy piece to do. Just tilt your brush on the side and just follow the lines nicely round. And then with the flatter panels on the chainsword, there are some mini details on that flat panel. Not too many, to be honest, but you can just sort of use your imagination a little bit here. So I apply it to where the yellow meets the black, and then sort of in the corners really. It'll be a bit more clearer when we get to that. When we get to the final photos. What we can now do is highlight up the black. Now I'm taking Games Workshop Eshin Grey, and I'm applying that, with a little bit of water, and applying that to where those little details are on the chainsword. There's a couple of little sort of engraved lines and so on. And then all we can do is add a little bit of white to that as well, and just pick out a couple of little corner sections, rather than trying to go, super bright grey or white on that black. And then what we do now is we just tone it all back down again with Nuln Oil, just on the black section here, just to bind those highlights together, so they don't look, super bright and super leery highlights. They just need to be sort of subtle and just do the job exactly as they're supposed to do. So just nice and subtle highlighting on the black. Otherwise, if you highlight black too much, it just looks like grey. And while that Nuln Oil is out, we can just go over the red. I did say earlier in the video when I was painting the red that we just need to shade those little sections in. So while I've got that colour out, I can just go and shade those little bits of red in. Now, other than some really fine detail work that you can do or decide not to do, it's entirely up to you. The model is now ready for, final assembly. So all I'm going to do is glue it to its base, and then just glue the top shell on, and then find a suitable position for those weapon arms. And then, you can glue it straight to the base, or you can come up with a really thematic and super amazing looking base. Whatever fits your army, if this is going into a Mechanicum army, or it's going into a Titan Legion army, or however you're doing it, if you want it to match your existing forces, and this is just like a bolt-on Lord of War choice, obviously base it accordingly. Now my knights are all based very similar. They're not a very exciting base because I don't tend to want it to detract from the model itself. But I'll get to the basing at another stage. I don't really want to cover that in the video because, it's no good to you watching me base something if you're going to base it entirely differently. That's the way I see it anyway. So yeah, the final stage is just to put it together here. So we can get all the rest of the pieces all ready to go. So just for the final stages, just while that torso is dried. That's now fully dried. And all I've done is I've painted the head up. Now, I haven't showed that in the video, but it is painted exactly the same as using all the other techniques within this video series, so part 1 and part 2. So if you want to go back and catch all those, or paint the head entirely as you see fit, I've just made it so that it keeps the theme. So it's got a bit of gold, bit of brass, red eyes, and a metallic exoskeleton. Is that the right word for a metallic head? I'm not really sure. But the rest of it is all the standard metal work that I've done earlier. And then, as I said, the red and the gold trim. Now, when you're putting the arms on, they are, you're supposed to have the top flat bit of that elbow or the shoulder pivot towards the top. But because I haven't glued these weapons, you can rotate them and put them either on the left hand or the right hand, however you see fit. Now I've got this guy sort of striding forwards, looking like he's looking for a target, looking all mean and menacing. So if his left foot is forward, his right arm would be back. And in this case, that's exactly what I've got. And if your right foot is back, your right arm is forward, you know. So it looks like it's a natural kind of walking pace. If you imagine yourself walking down the road and you know which arm follows which leg, that's the kind of pose that I've gone for. And there we go, we are done. So there we go then, guys. That is the end of part 2 of the Armiger Warglaive painting guide. Hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've been following along. Hope you've picked up maybe a couple of new tips and tricks that you want to apply to your own. As I said, I've specifically gone for the Legio Astorum, the Warp Runners, which matches the rest of my Titans. I know it may not be technically fluffy correct. I'm still looking for some background on Armiger Warglaives joining the Mechanicum proper, rather than fighting for households or being rivals or whatever. I know they did with the regular knights at some stage. There was some background for it, so that's why I've adopted it. And I don't want to divert from that. I've got a nice looking force that I can roll out the big boys and the big armour when I need to. But as I said, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. And I'll catch you guys on the next video.